Hey, AP Psych, welcome back to the Underground. I hope you all had a very happy Easter, and I'm excited because we are about to finish our modules for this unit and for the whole book. We don't have to worry about units 12, 13, or 14 for the AP test, and that's some pretty exciting news. So we'll finish up these modules. I have a free response for you that's going to be a research-oriented free response. And then the rest of the year after we finish that free response will be devoted to practicing free responses and reviewing previous units. So let's begin. One of the big enduring issues we're going to deal with to start with is the question of stability versus change. Does intelligence stay the same over time, or does it alter? And what's really interesting, and this is a very important thing for the research-oriented free response, we get different results if we look at cross-sectional research versus longitudinal research. If you guys remember correctly, cross-sectional studies are a very inexpensive and fast way to study change over time. Basically, you get a group of people who are one age, and then another group of people who are, let's say, 3 years older, and another group of people who are 3 years older than that, and you end up with something like 20 different cohorts, and you study them all for the same factor and see if you see a shift over age. And what's very interesting when we look at intelligence from a cross-sectional perspective is that IQ appears to go downhill, that the older we get, IQ seems to drop. But if we do a longitudinal study, and this would be a study in which we have one cohort and we track their progress on a particular characteristic over the course of a lifetime, so we keep checking the same people every 3 years, then we find that intelligence tends to start going up around age 20, and then it kind of peaks in the 50s and then starts by the mid-50s to start declining a little bit, but even into the 70s, it still is higher than it was back in the early 20s, and it's only in the 80s that we start to see it dip below what it was in the 20s. So why do we get such startling differences? Well, if you think about this idea, cross-sectional studies, remember way back, we like that they're cheap, we like that they're fast, we like that we don't get any dropouts, but the problem is that we end up introducing all kinds of extra variables, right? If you look at how a 5-year-old is raised today, and you compare what that 5-year-old has experienced compared to a 7-year-old, they've had very different upbringings. The life at age 5 for a 70-year-old is very different than what life at age 5 is for a contemporary 5-year-old. We know all about the Flynn effect, right? That scores on intelligence tests keep on going up over time. So what basically happens is each generation gets better and better at taking intelligence tests, standardized tests of any sort, really. So if you compare the test-taking skills of a 20-year-old today versus a 70-year-old who really hasn't gone through as many standardized tests in a lifetime as the 20-year-old probably did this year, then you're going to see what looks like a drop in performance. But if you take today's 20-year-old and you put him through a longitudinal study and check on his scores every 5 years, what you'll find is that he'll tend to improve in his test-taking ability through his 50s. It'll start to taper off in mid-50s. And then, like I said, it will start to decline but it won't dip below the point of where the person was at age 20 until the person's in the 80s on average. So that's a really interesting thing, right? These two different studies end up giving us wildly different results. And this is a thing that researchers can use to create untrustworthy data. Like if you want to prove that your point is the right one, that people get stupid over time, then maybe you deliberately choose a cross-sectional study and you end up with a valid study that gets the results you want. Or maybe if those aren't the results you want, maybe you want to show that people improve over time, then you just order a longitudinal study and you have to stick with it. It's going to be a very tall order and a very expensive order, but you'll get the opposite. Now, does this mean longitudinal studies are right? Well, remember the advantages are that you eliminate these conflicting variables, these extraneous variables, or what we call confounding variables, right? Variables that end up messing with the data because everybody's from the same cohort. You compare the same people, checkpoint after checkpoint after checkpoint. But remember that a lot of times people who start a study don't necessarily finish the study. So there may be significant important aspects of the data that we lose as people either start dropping out of the study or if they start dying out from the study. Maybe those people who die would have dipped the numbers a little bit further. Or maybe people who drop out end up skewing the data as well, right? So we still have problems. We can't completely trust the longitudinal study, even though it does eliminate confounding variables that we're just bound to experience in the cross-sectional study. What else can we talk about? In general, if we're looking at intelligence change over time, we have to look at two different types of intelligence. One is crystallized intelligence, and this would be things like what I know, what I know how to do, what I have learned over time. It would also be my ability to assess what I know. So not only have I picked up more and more data over time, but I learned how to use it and apply it, right? This would all fit under crystallized intelligence. And crystallized intelligence increases over time. It really just keeps on going up until, the very end. It dips around 80 or 90, but that's frequently because things like dementia or Alzheimer's kick in. But if you control for that, we basically keep on growing in crystallized intelligence throughout our lives. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, is at its highest point for most people in the early 20s, and then it starts slowing down a little bit, right? So we see kind of this steady decrease in fluid intelligence, and then by the time you hit 80 or so, it starts really declining fast. And fluid intelligence is kind of our processing speed or our mental agility. It's the ability to solve problems quickly. It's the ability to recall information quickly. So it becomes a little bit more difficult to pull information from long-term memory the older we get. And it also becomes more challenging to do things like solve complex math problems quickly, or to come up with the right word quickly, or to drop that great one-liner or something like that. Now, you can practice fluid intelligence. You can do a lot throughout your life to keep your fluid intelligence sharp. One of the reasons why we see fluid intelligence dip as people get older is a lot of times when you're retired, you just kind of, you don't get to talk to many people anymore. You deprive yourself of a lot of experiences. You watch a lot of TV. And so that fluid intelligence doesn't get as much practice as it used to get. It does decline over time, but we also find that we use it very hard when we're trying to establish our lives, in our 20s and our 30s. And we tend to kind of optimize it for the jobs that we do, and it starts to slip off in other ways. So, for instance, right now, I can help a lot of people with essay topics and keep a lot of different things straight. I can help people with struggles that they're having in AP Psych. I can solve all kinds of problems that come my way in the hall. I can try to organize Kairos. At the same time, if you try to quiz me on German, I haven't used my German vocabulary in a very long time, and it's not going to come to mind very quickly. If you give me math problems, I'm going to probably be pretty slow with them, unless it's things like taking averages or keeping a grade book or doing simple like psych math. Right, the more complex you make the math problem, the more time I'm going to have to put into it because I'm not practicing it as much as you guys are right now. Okay, so fluid intelligence tends to dip over time. Crystallized intelligence tends to increase over time. How about IQ tests? Do IQs tend to stay consistent over time? Well, if you give an IQ test to a kid under three, it's not going to be particularly predictive of the child's intelligence later on. It doesn't seem to matter that much if you give a child an IQ test. It's not going to stay that consistent. After three, it basically its relevance to your later IQ score tends to increase until you hit age 11. And 11 seems to be that golden age where if I score a 120 on my IQ test at age 11, I'm probably going to be right around 120 when I'm in my 30s. It'll stay fairly consistent. Now, the IQ, though, I want you to remember this concept that nature tends to guide IQ a little bit more than nurture. But for all of us, we have this kind of zone of IQ. So it might be that my range might run as low as 100 and as high as 130. And if I have the kind of upbringing and the kind of intellectual challenge and the kind of grit, and if I have people in my lives pushing after me to optimize my intelligence, if I'm secure, if I'm well fed, if I exercise, like if everything in my life is lining up perfectly, I might lean more toward 130. On the other hand, if I'm deprived of proper nutrition when I'm a child, if I'm around environmental toxins, if I have very little stimulation, if no one's playing educational games or reading with me or making me sing songs, any of that kind of stuff, I might dip down more toward the 100, right? So the expression of my genetic predisposition is guided by nurture, but I have a genetic predisposition that is guided by nature. Now, there's some interesting things with intelligence. One thing would be that high intelligence positively correlates with a long, healthy life. Now, this seems kind of strange, right? Does this mean if I'm intelligent, I'm going to live longer? That somehow I'm going to outsmart my enemies and create a great living for myself and live a long time? And what about all these people who seem to be very bright, but they die young? Where's this positive correlation coming from? Here are a few guesses our book talks about. One is that highly intelligent people tend to have better education, which tends to mean they have better jobs, which tends to mean they have better income, which tends to mean that they have healthier diets, healthier environments. They tend to also understand the importance of exercise and proper diet and stuff like that. They know not to smoke cigarettes. They tend to know how to stay healthy. This is one theory. It could also be that one of the main reasons you're intelligent is because you escaped prenatal complications and early childhood disease that might have deprived you of oxygen or that might have deprived you of proper nutrition or stuff like that. So maybe the fact that you didn't have these complications in your childhood means that you're going to live longer and you're going to end up with the possibility to be more intelligent, right? To maximize that zone of intelligence. It could also be that you are well wired, right? That you are kind of blessed with mental agility and physical agility, and both of these things together make it so that you are more predisposed to live a long life. So remember, whenever we're looking at correlations, we don't want to make assumptions about causality. It could be that intelligence causes long life. It could be that a long life has a symptom of making you intelligent. Right, I live longer, so I gain in intelligence over time, something like that, or I have better experiences because of my health, which helps shape my expression of intelligence. Or it could be that there's some other factor, right? Maybe just I was well wired, and that creates both good health and intellect. Okay, so always think about correlation versus causality, particularly when they ask you to interpret data on the second free response question. Let's talk about disability and ability. So to be intellectually disabled means two things. First is that your IQ has to rank in the bottom third. And roughly speaking, that means that you land a 70 or lower on the IQ scale. And then the other thing would be that you struggle to live by yourself in terms of conceptual, social, and practical skills. Conceptual skills mean you can't really do math, you can't really read, you're not very literate. So you can't like manage a household budget, you can't do your bills, things like that. You just can't read or do math well enough. Social, can you actually follow the law without breaking it? Can you stay out of trouble? Do you know how to interact with people, make friends, have a social network? Can you avoid being victimized? And then the third would be practical. Can you keep yourself clean? Can you keep your room or your house clean? Can you keep a job? Can you cook for yourself? All of these sorts of things guide the decision of whether you actually qualify as intellectually disabled. Now, I think it's interesting when we look at IQ tests is that the Flynn effect keeps on shifting scores as tests are standardized, right? So every few years we have to re-standardize tests because of the Flynn effect. We nowadays, instead of just saying 100 is a fixed score, we just use 100 IQ to mean average. So if IQ tests keep going up, if the scores on IQ tests keep going up, then we look at the normal curve. Whatever that most common score is at the top of the bell curve, let's say that's 105. Now that like the 105 on the test now is going to be recalibrated to be a 100. So what's really interesting is, let's say there's a 5-year-old test and it's going to be restandardized. I take it on a Tuesday and I score 105, then they recalibrate that. I was perfectly average. That means on Wednesday, I'm 100, right? Once it's recalibrated. Now, what that would mean is that if I was a 60, or if I was a 73 on Tuesday, then on Wednesday, I'm now a 68. And what that would mean is that I went from having low intelligence to having an intellectual disability as the test was recalibrated. And our book tells the story of a woman who wouldn't have been put to death for a crime if she had qualified as being intellectually disabled, but she scored a 72 on the test. If she would have scored a 69 that year, then she would have been considered intellectually disabled and wouldn't have been allowed to be put to the death penalty. So that's kind of creepy stuff. Okay, what else do we have? Let's look at the high end. So you guys remember Terman, his link to eugenics. He had these kids called termites that were very like they were kind of his chosen kids who were going to show the world the values of creating gifted children programs where you push the gifted children extra hard. You give them better resources in school, you give them greater challenges, you give them teachers who are experts in their fields, like you throw all your PhD people at the gifted students. And you give them adult level work and adult level challenges. And the result is that when you do this for gifted students, they tend to be high performers as adults. Their IQ does tend to stay consistent, and they do tend to continue to achieve as adults at a rate greater than the average population. But think about nature versus nurture here. We run into a problem in which it could be that the kid's natural IQ is pushing the kid's success, but it could also be that you just surrounded the child with all of these extra resources and all of these challenging assignments and all of these great field trips. And basically this kid, because of his high IQ score, ends up getting teachers who not only challenge him or her really hard, but also believe in his or her ability to succeed and push harder because of that. There's a problem in education that we call the self-fulfilling prophecy. This is not in this chapter. I think it sort of mentioned in Module 2, but it's a very important concept. The self-fulfilling prophecy basically says that if we believe something is true about other people, then we behave toward them in such a way that what we believe about them becomes the truth. This is a terrifying idea in education. There have been hundreds of variations on a very simple study, and that is that people go to teachers and they tell them something about their students that are coming into their new classroom, right? They tell teachers either that these kids are really gifted, or they say these kids are really struggling. And gifted and struggling have nothing to do with their IQs. People are just making up these terms, randomly assigning people as either the gifted group or the struggling group. And what tends to happen is if teachers believe the students are gifted, then those children end up with higher grades. And if teachers believe that the students are struggling students or average students, they tend to have lower grades. Why is this if their assignment into the gifted group or into the average group has nothing to do with their intelligence? Well, basically, teachers push kids that they think are gifted hard. If a kid is not succeeding, but a teacher believes he's gifted, then the teacher will go and push that kid harder, won't let the kid make excuses. If a girl is believed to be gifted and she hands in mediocre work, the teacher makes her redo it until it's as good as the person believes it can be. Now, if someone is handing in average work and is believed to be average, the teacher's like, okay, he's achieving right where he ought to. Or if a teacher believes the student's dumb and the person hands in average work, then maybe the teacher is like, wow, that was really exceptional. Nice work. Good for you, right? And you get all these accolades for doing average work instead of being challenged to create great work. So this is a huge problem. I try never to know what people's ACT or SAT scores are. I never know what anyone's IQ scores are. I go out of my way to make sure that I believe everybody is absolutely brilliant. I'm not saying that I'm without bias or anything like that, but it's very important to me to believe that everybody is a high achiever, and my tendency is not to think about lowering the bar so that people can achieve, but how can I raise the floor? I remember when I was doing my student teaching, my cooperating teacher said, always teach to the middle, because the middle's the best that the low can ever hope to achieve. The high are going to achieve no matter what you give them, and the middle basically achieve at the middle. So always teach to the middle. My thought from going to Country Day and very challenging schools, U of M, stuff like that, was that you should always teach above the top. And then when people aren't reaching where you need them to reach, help them figure out what they can do to reach those standards. What skills do they need? What kind of practice do they need? How can you break down the spots where things are falling apart and fix those? So that's the ideal I shoot for, and that I think most teachers try to shoot for. Excellent. So, if you put people in the gifted program, yeah, they're going to succeed. But if you treat everyone like they're gifted, you are going to get a classroom full of people who succeed, instead of just, making it so that the brilliant people get the resources and everyone else gets patted on the back for mediocre work. Let's shift to module 63. We are doing great. So, what do twin and adoption studies tell us about intelligence? Remember this, that nature has more of an effect on the expression of intelligence than nurture does. Again, think about this idea of a range. Let's say I have a 20-point range. If I'm raised well, I'm going to be toward that upper end of the range. If I'm deprived of the resources that I need to grow intellect, I'm going to perform at the lower end of that range. But that range seems to be genetically predisposed. So what do we know? Identical twins raised together have IQ scores that are just about the same as if we gave the same person the same test twice. Right? Very, very, very little difference in IQ test scores. Not only that, but if you look at the amount of gray matter compared to white matter in the brains of identical twins, if you look at what regions of their brains function as they're performing tasks, more or less identical brain function. Identical twins' brains look and function the same way. It doesn't seem to be that nurture plays nearly the same amount of role as nature does in the expression of intelligence for identical twins. What else do we know? There is no smart gene. Intelligence is polygenetic. It is a complex interaction of a number of genetic factors, all of which have epigenetic factors based on the nutrition we receive as children, the amount of stimulation we receive as children, all of that kind of stuff. So there is no smart gene. You can't figure out if this person's going to be smart or dumb based on looking at some gene. We're looking at the interaction of many genes plus many environmental factors. If you have identical twins who are raised apart, most of the time, if they have, if they're both raised in stable, healthy families, they're going to have nearly identical intelligences. If you want to try to create a rift between their intelligences, one child has to basically grow up in poverty and abuse and neglect, and the other child has to grow up with every advantage. And in that case, you start to see that there's a rift in IQ scores. And what that tends to suggest is here are the factors that are going to lead people toward lower intelligence, and here are the factors that are going to lead people toward higher intelligence. When I think about social justice in our society, I think it is the job of all adults to take care of all of the kids, right? Our number one function is to make sure that all kids have great advantages. I think this is what being a woman means, or what being a man means, that we take care of kids. I don't really care about the politics of it. If you want to say that the private sector is responsible for that, great, we are. If you want to say the public sector is responsible for that, yes, we are. But this is just a basic human thing. Are we taking care of our kids? What we can learn from these factors of nature and nurture is that we can bump intelligence, we can bump so many things for the good of society if we take care of children well during their formative years. Okay, so let's continue here. Page 3. Along these lines, let's say you have kids who grow up experiencing neglect or mistreatment or starvation, and then you bring them into a home of safety, kindness, and prosperity. Guess what? IQ goes up. IQ is not that fixed, right? There's a zone of expression, probably around 20 points. You can boost it if you feed kids well. You can boost that if you give them challenging activities and lots of playtime, and if you can help them feel secure in the world and loved, and if you, play sports with them, if you read with them, if you, any of this kind of stuff, it all boosts IQ. But if kids are hungry and they're afraid and they're neglected, their IQ scores are not going to come out as high. IQs of adopted children more closely resemble the IQs of their biological parents than their adopted parents. So, unless you have these huge gulfs in the upbringing that kids experience, they're going to tend to match their biological parents more because our biology is more genetically controlled than environmentally. But again, range. What is going to be the expression of your inborn intellectual range? Are you going to be maximized toward the upper end of it, or are you going to fall toward the bottom of it? Very important figure in the research of intellect and childhood upbringing is J. McVicker Hunt, whose research was largely responsible for the creation of Project Head Start back in the 60s. And Head Start basically had this premise that if you take impoverished children and you get them into preschool early, you get them proper daycare, you give them a safe place to play, you give them an environment where they learn educational games and social skills, and they get to have fun, and they get breakfast and lunch included, nutritious food, and you can basically take them out of the struggles of poverty, you can take them out of the struggles of neglect, you can keep them active and stimulated, then IQ scores go up, the likelihood that they will finish high school later on in life goes up, the likelihood that they are going to go on to secondary education improves, and basically by every measure, their intellectual achievement improves. Now, childhood is not the only factor, right? So if you give them Head Start and then ignore everybody through middle school and high school, you undo a lot of the good that you've done at the early ages, right? It's not just like we need to take care of kids when they're young. We need to basically work them through the whole system, right? Basically, what Head Start shows us is that we can make dramatic improvements to a child's likelihood of success if we intervene when they're young. But we also need to intervene through the whole system, right? It's not like, oh, I'm 11 now, and now I'm all set, right? I was not very secure or intelligent or safe as an 11-year-old, right? Maybe by 11-year-old standards, not by human being standards. I needed a great community of people taking care of me. Okay. J. McVicker Hunt, 1982, he went to Iran and he spent some time in orphanages, and there are many, many, many parallel stories about these experiences. If you look at Russian orphanages under communism, if you look at like Romanian orphanages, that basically if kids get very little attention as babies, they just stop crying because crying doesn't actually achieve anything for them, and they become what McVicker Hunt called glum lumps. They just don't do anything. They don't respond to stimuli. They don't cry for things that they need. They just are unresponsive. But he found that if you could take these kids and you could play educational games with them, especially games that built language skills, if you could get them moving around, playing follow the leader, if you could work on their motor coordination, you can undo most of the damage that early neglect and poverty was creating. You can actually, the more you work with the kids, the faster you can help children through some of the major developmental milestones. So very, very, very important. As Catholics, as human beings, we have a responsibility to really serve children, particularly in these very vulnerable years. Let's see. Here's a really interesting one. Poverty tends to impede fluid intelligence. So you guys know how hard it is to concentrate, how hard it is to focus, how hard it is to achieve when you are hungry. And if you go sometimes days without having a square meal or without having enough nutrition, you know it's very hard to focus. But there's another problem. Think about right now. I'm not saying that our plight compares to the plight of the poor, but think about how difficult it is right now to do your schoolwork and to feel focused in these days of the fear of COVID-19. You know, I don't know about you guys, but on the one hand, I don't have the same number of pressing responsibilities that I had back when I was teaching every day. Some things have changed for me. What used to take me 20 minutes to plan now takes me about 12 hours to create. You know, these online videos are a challenge for me, and I've had to learn a lot of skills. But I'm not solving a barrage of problems on a daily basis. I'm not giving a bunch of lectures like I normally do. So you would think that life would be a little bit easier for me. And you guys probably don't have schedules that are as packed as they used to be. But think about all the energy that you put into worrying about the health of people that you love and the finances of people you care about and what the next few months are going to look like, and how much you miss people in your life and how you're afraid. All of these sort of things take up a lot of cognitive bandwidth, right? We're constantly worrying, and because we're constantly worrying, we can't spend as much time focusing on things like reading our Frankenstein or nailing the AP test, right? I don't know, maybe that's not your experience. Some people might really be having a great time right now. But I think for the most part, people probably feel like they're putting in long hours and not achieving very much when they're used to putting in possibly shorter hours and achieving at a really, really high rate. So think about this idea. If I'm a kid and I don't know when I'm going to eat again, my home isn't safe, my parents are always worried about money, I don't feel like anyone's in my corner, and I'm neglected for big periods of the day. It's probably going to be a challenge for me to do story problems, not because I don't have the cognitive capacity, but because between the hunger and the anxiety, I'm just not going to be able to focus. That all takes up a lot of cognitive bandwidth. There's another problem that we run into, and this goes into social psychology a little bit more, and cognitive psychology. This is called the scarcity mindset. When we feel like we are in the middle of some type of scarcity, that we don't have enough of something, like something that's necessary for survival, we tend to get silly and make bad decisions. And this is another problem with cognitive bandwidth, that we jam so many of our frequencies, so much of our thought goes to the anxiety and the fear and these problems that we can't really solve, that we start to make amygdala-based decisions. Probably right now one of the biggest problems that we're all experiencing as a result of the scarcity mindset is the toilet paper shortage. People freaked out when they learned that we were going to be locked down, and a lot of people bought way more toilet paper than they actually needed, way more cleaning supplies than they actually needed, and as a result, we have a shortage. Even people who went out and got sane amounts of it probably still made other silly decisions. For instance, I don't think I hoarded. I think I have a safe amount of cleaning supplies, but at the same time, when I went shopping, I bought lots of pop and lots of chips because, who knows when I'm going to be able to get them again. Except I have maybe had 2 chips all year up until the lockdown, and I pretty much hadn't had pop in months. So how come when there's a perceived shortage, I need lots of junk food in the house? But when there's not a perceived shortage, I don't really need any junk food in the house. Do you guys follow this one? There's something where my amygdala starts making the decisions because my prefrontal cortex is all tied up with my anxieties and my fears and trying to solve problems that don't have a solution clearly in front of me. So this is one of the problems that we struggle with when people are deprived of resources. Let's see here. On the other hand, let's say you have success in school. Success in school promotes a growth mindset. So if we stack the deck so that people have proper nutrition, they have proper education, lots of fun, a safe place to go to school every day. Let's say we give kids all the resources that they need and they start achieving. Achieving is fun, we like it, and we start wanting to achieve more and more. And this is the growth mindset. Success in education tends to promote more success in education. As we accomplish great intellectual feats, we want to accomplish even greater ones, right? So this is the growth mindset. This is something that if you have success in school, you just want to keep on having more success in school. And this is the mindset that we want to establish for all kids, right? This idea that the experience of school makes them want to learn even more, not to dread school or not to be full of worry about what they're going to experience outside of school. And we are on to Module 64. So let's start with gender differences. Here is one bell curve, right? We've got one normal curve, perfect normal curve. Let me try this again. Here is one normal curve. Okay, that is, let's call this the normal curve for female intelligence. Then we have the male normal curve. Exactly the same, except it goes out here a little bit farther. So what we find with male versus female intelligence, as far as IQ is concerned, it is identical. The average IQ for men and women, no real difference. Nothing that is statistically significant. But at the same time, we don't find that the curves are identical all the way through. They're identical until you get to these little parts out here. And then what you find is that when we're looking at these outliers, these statistical outliers, that males tend to have a little more representation in the ultra high and a little more representation in the ultra low. So the extremes of intelligence in terms of being gifted and in terms of intellectual disability tend to be a little bit more skewed toward men than toward women. But if we just look at the averages, we line up the same. That doesn't mean that male and female intelligence are always identical. Women tend to outpace males in terms of spelling, verbal fluency, locating objects, detecting emotions, and then in terms of sensitivity to taste, touch, and color. So women have us beat in a lot of different ways, but men, we have women beat in terms of spatial ability and the ability to perform complex math. But even when we look at these differences in terms of spatial ability and in terms of verbal fluency, it's not like a major difference. It's not some major advantage. It's just that men are slightly better with the spatial intelligence and with the very abstract, difficult mathematical computations. Like we're a little faster at it apparently or something like that. And women are a little better with the verbal skills, with the empathy skills, with the emotional intelligence, and with the sensitivity to the senses. So it's interesting, and there's a lot of debate over whether this is the product of nature or nurture. Evolutionary psychologists like to believe that men have better spatial perception because it was an advantage to hunters and allowed us to protect the tribe, and it allowed us to live to reproduce more successfully. And evolutionary biologists would also like to believe that Women tended to be gatherers, and their ability to spot edible plants and pick them gave them an evolutionary advantage. I don't see why these things necessarily have to be gendered. I also think it's interesting that we can't say when Freud says, it deals with repressed childhood issues, that's scientifically not valid. But when we basically say, our ancestors needed to be successful hunters, right? And that's why men are so great with spatial skills. Where's the scientific proof for that? That's theoretical to me also. I don't know that I necessarily buy it that well. We could look at a nurture argument here pretty easily. It's very clear that parents tend to play catch with boys more than they play with girls. They tend to put girls into more creative and decorative type activities than they do with boys. There's an explanation that has to do with nurture. These differences are sort of universal, but there are all these exceptions to them. For instance, in England and Britain and the US, we tend to find that men outperform women in terms of science. But if we look at international science exams, the same tests, Asian and Russian women tend to outperform Asian and Russian men. So there is sort of this cultural component to it. If we look at cultures that tend to have have more egalitarian societies, Scandinavian countries, Iceland, stuff like that, there isn't really a gender math gap anymore. But if we look at cultures that are very paternalistic, that have very strong cultural expectations of gender, then for instance, Turkey and Korea, they have a gigantic science gap and a gigantic math gap. They favor men. So there's a cultural component. The last thing we have to talk about would be race and ethnicity and IQ. And I think it's important to read what the book has to say, but we can sum this up pretty easily. What we tend to find is that where there is a culture that has a majority culture and a minority culture, and this is basically every culture on the planet, the majority culture tends to outperform the minority culture in tasks that require intellect. But is that because the majority culture is always more intelligent and the minority culture is always less intelligent? No. What you tend to find is that the majority culture tends to have everything that is necessary to move IQ toward the high end. So the majority culture always makes sure that it has great educational opportunities, that it has security, that it has proper nutrition, that it has economic opportunity, that it has a wide range of jobs that it can do, all of that sort of stuff. And it generally makes sure that the minority culture doesn't have those options. And then what you frequently see from the majority culture in any culture we're looking at around the world, I'm not picking on any one culture, but what you tend to see is that the majority culture takes after it deprives the minority culture of the materials that it needs to succeed, it then says, look at the minority culture, they're not as intelligent as we are, and so all of these resources would be wasted on them. So the fact that they're underperforming ends up becoming the validation the majority uses to deny the very things that would improve the plight of the minority culture. So if we want a fair society, by the way, intelligence tests, the U.S. Army, up until World War II, used to give an officer's intelligence test, And the officer's intelligence test really didn't measure IQ, it measured affluence. It was a very interesting test. If I took it, it would ask me things like, what is the best type of caviar to purchase? It would ask me things about, where my fish fork belonged on the table setting. And basically, if I didn't come from a privileged background, I wouldn't know the answers to all of these. The test wasn't really designed to figure out who is going to be intelligent enough to be an officer. It was designed to figure out, did you come from a wealthy, privileged background? Because those were the people that the old military wanted in charge. That tends to be far less true today. And so that's an interesting sort of thing, right? We always have to look at intelligence tests and figure out, are they fair to all cultures or are they not fair? When I was a kid, the SAT used to have an analogy section that was a very difficult part of the test. You had to have a very sophisticated vocabulary in order to pass the analogies test. This word is to that word as this word is, and then they'd give you 5 choices. And even if you understood the relationship between the words, if you didn't know the vocabulary word in the list, you couldn't get the question right. And it was a great indicator of success in college because it was such a difficult verbal challenge. At the same time, though, if you did not come from a wealthy background, you were not very likely to have gone to a school that would have taught you vocabulary that would have appeared on the test. So there was a very strong economic bias built into the test, and that's why that section is no longer on the SAT and nothing like it is on the ACT. So there's been a big move toward fairness in terms of these tests. At the same time, we run into other issues. One of these issues is bias. And there are 2 types of bias. There's explicit bias, which would basically be where I'm very overt in my biases. I recognize that there are certain types of people that I don't like or that I hold stereotypes against. And that there are certain types of people that I do like and that I want to just generally kind of favor. There's also implicit bias where I don't really have any understanding of the fact that I discriminate, right? I believe that I love everybody. I believe that everyone's equal, but without even realizing it, I discriminate. I perpetuate stereotypes, all that kind of stuff. And we all have implicit biases and we all have explicit biases, but I think we work on the explicit biases, and a lot of times we don't check ourselves on the implicit because we're not that aware of them. When we're talking about the self-fulfilling prophecy, there is a strange problem with the self-fulfilling prophecy. There's one that we could call the stereotype threat. And this is a self-fulfilling prophecy that we kind of use on ourselves. The idea here is that if we believe that a person who is evaluating us holds negative stereotypes against us, we will actually underperform on the assignment. So if I'm taking an intelligence test and I believe that the person who is administering the intelligence test thinks that my people are stupid, I'm actually going to be less likely to do well on the test. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, no, personally, I would do better. If someone's not in my corner, if someone's like trying to stand against me, I'm going to show that person, right? So maybe you would be wired for a fight response rather than a flight response. Maybe your thought would be, I'm going to let my haters be my motivators, right? Maybe you have this success mindset and this growth mindset, and you really like a challenge and you like showing the people who are against you, that you're number one. Personally, I know that I'm an insecure dancer. I feel very awkward about my dancing abilities because I'm not that physically talented. So if I were going to go dance at a party or something like that, let's say I'm at my high school reunion and they're playing a song I love and I'm going to go dance. If I'm with a bunch of friends who are all like, yeah, let's go dance, it'll be so much fun, then I'm probably pretty likely to go and dance with them. But if I'm sitting with people in high school who I knew were really good dancers and who I still think are really cool, and they say, hey, Will, remember what a nerd you were in high school? My thought's not going to be, I'm going to go show them by dancing harder than Napoleon Dynamite. My thought's going to be, I want to get out of this situation as quickly as possible. I'm not cool. I know they're going to be judging me. They're going to laugh at me. I just want to get this over with as quickly as possible, or I want to run away, right? So I think this is the concept behind the stereotype threat. We could also think about this in terms of cognitive bandwidth. If I start focusing during a test on whether I think the person giving the test holds negative views about me, if I start getting all revved up about these negative cognitions, it's going to impede my ability to succeed on the test, right? I'm just not going to have enough of my prefrontal cortex devoted to the test. Too much of what's going on in my life is going to be rooted in my amygdala. Do you guys follow this concept? It's the numbers and the cake all over again. The numbers versus the fruit salad versus the cake. If we tie up too much of this prefrontal cortex with stuff that isn't task related, our amygdala is going to make the decisions for us. So what can we do here? Oh, and the interesting thing with the stereotype threat, no one actually has to make an overt statement of stereotype against you. You could just assume that the other person is holding certain ideas, right? I could assume that cool people are getting ready to laugh at me when I dance, and that's going to impede my dancing as much as if they say, hey, nerd, you can't dance. Do you guys follow that? Good. Hey, guess what I just said? Do you guys follow that? It's been a while. Good to be with you guys. I love you. Let's go to the end zone here. So the last thing we have to talk about, how can we eliminate bias? Most of us are doing what we can to eliminate explicit bias. And when we aren't like going after our explicit bias, other people go after it for us, right? People call us on our bias. The implicit bias, though, what do you do if you're an employer and you're not aware of your implicit bias, but you look at your workforce and you're like, wow, I'm not really well represented by the general population in my workforce. We're skewed too far in these directions. I must have some sort of bias. How do I eliminate that? Or maybe the people who are doing the hiring in my corporation have this bias. What do I do? What we're finding more and more is that a lot of companies are trying to remove face-to-face conversation from most or all of the interviews, right? So if you don't see people and you don't hear people, then all you have to go on from the interviews is the words that they say. And if people are being evaluated basically on resumes that don't show their names, and if people are being evaluated on their answers to questions, and you can't know if they're male or female, you can't know their sexual persuasion, you can't know their race or ethnicity, if all of that is blind, then you can't really let your implicit bias color the results that you get. So I think we're going to see more and more of this kind of blind interviewing as we start to become more and more concerned with bias. I put a special test online for you, the Harvard bias test. A lot of people take this test. You can do it. It's a bunch of implicit biases. You can kind of pick and see, hey, am I an ageist person? Do I not like old people? You know, you can kind of pick whatever the group is, and you answer these questions that don't seem to be overtly about anything, and it can kind of tell if you have biases built into your views of another group. So that's there for you to play with on the Moodle page. What else do we have to talk about? I think we are good. Thank you guys so much for joining me, and congratulations. This is the end of the module. I'll put the free response up by tomorrow evening, Wednesday evening, and this video is going up ASAP. Take care, and thanks for joining me in the underground.